Somebody said to me recently, you know, why did you choose such a sedate style? And my answer is that it's not sedate at all. It's very controlled and composed, and shots go long and the camera doesn't move a lot. But the effect is not sedating. The effect is sensitizing. The effect is enlivening. The effect, I think, puts you on your toes or brings you to the edge of your seat. You become so sensitive to what's happening on the subtlest level of everything. And the entire style is really designed to heighten your awareness to what is happening.
I think it's really important to have a kind of mantra or roadmap visually for a film. I'm always trying to define that so that when you get into a situation where you're walking in cold or you're under a time constraint or something changes, that you remember what it is that led you to your original idea.
Basically, the approach to this movie was, let's keep it simple. And it wasn't really, you know, it was budgetarily dictated by that, but also let's keep it, you know, let's keep it simple and clean.
We looked at a lot of pictures together. We looked at a lot of photographs, and very clearly we had this meeting with Adam Kimmel, the DP, and Jess and Bennett, and on that first meeting we all knew that we were speaking the same language. After looking at the same photographs, we clearly knew what needs to be within each frame.
One of the most fundamental and important roles of the director is to have a vision and make sure that everybody shares it.
Color palette was on all of our agenda pretty early, and there was one day, and I'm trying to remember exactly what it was that I brought, but I went to Bennett's apartment to meet with Jess and Bennett, and I brought a reproduction of a painting that I had been feeling was the right direction for the film, and it was based on conversations with Bennett that were very undefined too. We had talked about it in the abstract, but it was the first time I found something that represented the idea. And I walked in and showed it to Bennett, and he opened a book that he had marked a page on and had the same picture.
We decided there was going to be no red, there was going to be no blue in the entire movie, which was, I can tell you, extremely hard to do.
We knew that the palette needs to be very stark, it needs to be very muted, and it needs to be sort of deprived of strong colors, but at the same time extremely complex and very textured. And Bennett was very, very well prepared to present this to us on his first design meeting.
And we all, Kasha, myself, we just really stuck to that, you know, we stuck to that rule that we made up day one, and it really, I think, ended up being extraordinary.
We were obviously looking for a place that would be economical to shoot, but also that had the look of Kansas in the late 50s, early 60s, and that could also double for New York City and Brooklyn at that time. So it was sort of a tall order for a city. And amazingly, Winnipeg had that look.
It looks like Kansas. It's the same landscapes, it's the same, you know, architecture.
There are some closed down department stores that just have floors of great 50s furniture just there, waiting.
The downtown city had been preserved, and the areas around it, the towns around it, had been preserved so well that they actually were still towns from the 50s or earlier. And we were able to shoot almost the entire film in and around Winnipeg.
We'd been looking for that house, which we never thought would be difficult in Winnipeg, but once we got up there, Bennett had already looked at some stuff, and then I started going out with him and Jess, and the search widened and widened until we were doing like 2-hour drives, knowing that if we fell in love with a house, that we were going to give up 4 hours of each shoot day there.
Hired a helicopter, flew around for 2 days until I got nauseous up in that thing, and could not find it.
At one point we went really far off this road and made another turn and drove up through a clump of trees, and there was this falling down but perfect house.
Half of it was falling down. but it was on the greatest piece of land.
We found out it had been abandoned the year of the Clutter killings, strangely enough, and the farm was being farmed, but the house had just been sitting since 1959, so it just felt like our house, and Jess did a great job of like rallying all the people and having to, I think they dumped gravel down a 1.5-mile stretch of mud road so that trucks could get in if it rained.
We put like a third of the budget into fixing up that house and adding to it, and adding a roof on the garage and putting a driveway in and redoing the lawn and manicuring it, painting the barn and dressing all around it, because that was going to be like, that's the beginning of the movie, and that was going to be it.
We always wanted to shoot between when the leaves fell off the trees and when the snow came, in that period of like timeless brown, ugly winter. And at some point in prep, I had a camera flown in as a favor and put it in the trunk of my car and went out with a few rolls of film to some of the fields near the house we had picked. And a storm happened to be coming through that day, and I was able to shoot like 10 to 20-second frames of constantly changing light and wheat blowing and different weather, and it went from sun to clouds to black clouds to a windstorm to like the sun breaking through the clouds. And I put together I ran out of film shooting these little pieces, and in the end, some of the shots that Bennett chose, there was only 10 seconds of them. I mean, he had to go and like create another negative and make a loop and extend it to be long enough to use, but they worked out beautifully. I mean, we didn't have that weather very often, but in the day that I went out, I felt like I had a month's worth of diversity in the landscapes.
With Truman, it was about finding the nuances of the ever-changing Truman, of somebody who loved clothes, who was exposed to a lot of amazing choices. He worked for fashion magazines for years. He was very aware of fashion. I think he liked fashion, he liked clothes. But at the same time, I think he was totally unpredictable. And he created his own vocabulary and developed what is called his style.
Truman Capote from the New Yorker. Bergdorf's.
Sorry?
The scarf.
Oh, nice.
You know, there are so many anecdotes about Truman Capote. There are so many stories about Capote in Kansas at that time. But everybody was talking about Truman Capote showing up in Kansas in this long, floor-length camel coat. And I spent weeks researching a long, floor-length camel coat. And I was like, it just didn't exist. At that time, it just didn't exist. How did he come up with this? And then I thought, well, he was so short that he probably tried a coat in the store, and it became full length for him just because he was so short, and he decided not to shorten it. And I think that's how he ended up with this camel coat, and he believed it was fabulous at that time. The most amazing thing that Bennett did was choosing every extra that was in the movie. He picked every extra that ended up on the screen. And that made all of our jobs so much easier because he chose character people. So it wasn't that much that I needed to do with dressing them because the people were already, the material was already there.
If you can see an extra's face in this movie, they were specifically chosen from a pool of more than 1,000 that we looked at. Whether it's every single person in the courtroom or those faces in the diner or in the hanging or in the New York party scenes, everybody came from within like 10 miles of downtown Winnipeg, with the exception of 9 cast members.
We had about 1,000 people in the room, and we could not possibly dress 1,000 people. So what we did we dressed the first maybe 10 rows, and then all the back of the rows, the people were instructed what colors to bring, and then the whole crew was, you know, eliminating the colors that were too vivid, too bright.
Thank you.
But it worked. I mean, that's how you do the cheese.
A lot of time is spent in the jail cells, and how to keep that interesting for a third of the movie or whatever it is challenging.
The jail was the one set that we built in a warehouse in Winnipeg. And I had done a lot of research on death row. I'd gotten a lot of photos of that particular block, that death row block at the in Kansas was tore down, I think, in late 60s. So that wasn't around anymore. Couldn't get any evidence on that, but I just got a lot of research on a lot of death row, and so I had an idea of what it was. And it's described in the book. Each cell is 6 by 9. It had a window overlooking a warehouse where the gallows was. So through that, I just developed a plan, and that's the set that we built on stage.
The decision to shoot Super 35 was an intuitive sort of gut reaction to imagining this film. When you read the script, you get a picture of it in your head. And I think for a lot of people it went counter to logic, which is to say, if you're trying to create claustrophobia in a prison cell, why would you make a bigger frame? But my feeling was it feels smaller if you see 3 walls in the shot. If you shoot someone against a single wall, you don't feel the size of the room. And if you shoot them into a corner, well, yeah, a little bit. But if you feel 3 walls, then you understand that the room is 6 feet across.
We tested a lot of colors for the jail before we actually built it and painted it, when we did some camera tests, you know, very early on. And it came up with a few great colors, and eventually decided on this yellow color. And the whole thing was painted, and about 2 days before we were going to go in and shoot it, I took Bennett over to see it, and I could tell right away his reaction was, okay, I mean, the place is great, but something's on his mind. And then later on that night, he came to me and he said, what do you think about if we change the color in the jail cell? And I said, why? And he said, I think it's just a little too moody, and I'm afraid of putting the audience in a mood before they decide what their mood should be. And I thought about it, and he was right.
I would like now to apologize to Jess for that. Movies are made in editing. Editing, more than any other discipline, is filmmaking. The movie gets reconceived and rewritten, redirected, reacted in the editing.
I could see through how the film was being shot that there was a lot of thought behind it, down to like every detail, the production design, the clothing, the costume design, and Adam Kimmel's cinematography were all blended so beautifully. And obviously there was a grand design, and that was a strong indication that it was being directed well.
Many of my favorite moments in the film ended up being just silent passing notes, you know, before Truman goes on stage for the reading, when he's there in the wings, or before he enters the cell before the confession, or when he enters the Dewey home, he comes up to the door and we see him through the glass of the door, you know, in those beats when he doesn't believe he's being looked at. And what Chris Tellefson, the editor, and I were able to do is find those moments, and with the style, give profound emphasis to them.
This is a film that could have maybe played a little too long, but it never, you had to really be careful about where to play it long. And the behavior was a big part of playing it long. And Phil, like in the final goodbye scene, what he goes through, the process of what he goes through, is so beautifully expressed.
I wish I had more.
Mr. Capote.
Goodbye.
And that's like without a cut, you know, that's, you know, that is so alive. It's just so alive, but all the interchanges that come before it keep it rhythmically alive till the point where you can do that, which is that's the essence of artful editing, of finding those rhythms and patterns that sync with the story.
It is an amazing thing when a film comes together. If you're persistent and relentless in a vision and you believe it with enthusiasm and conviction, that all of the necessary people required to realize that vision become harmonized.
The level that everybody played on, Adam and Kasha and Bennett, Caroline, it was just higher than I've ever been on any film.
When you're inspired to do good work because you feel a project requires it of you, that stuff isn't so hard. I mean, there were scenes in the film where there was a shot of a train on a horizon that we wanted to do, and Bennett and I went out on 2 or 3 hours sleep. And he came really just to be supportive, drove 2 hours out into the prairie and stood out in a freezing cold cornfield. We heard the train coming and we jumped out and turned the camera on, and it wound up being one of those shots that every time we looked at for the whole editing process, we sort of remembered our commitment to the film. And and for me it was a big deal that Bennett was like, I'm coming with you. You're not going out there alone for a third time to wait for the train.
We shot all of our exterior stuff first, that we hoped and needed to have no snow on the ground. And although by our day one of shooting the previous year there was already half a foot, it did not snow. And when we called cut and wrap on our last exterior setup, there was less than a minute before big fat snowflakes began to fall. That's absolutely true. Like, we called cut before the camera was even off the tripod. We all looked up and it was snowing.
So, and it's collaboration. It's like continuous exchange of ideas. And I think that that's what's the most fascinating of working on the movie, because you're working with a group of people and it just goes further than you ever can imagine.
It's the 12th film that I've shot, and Bennett and I clicked in a way that I haven't had happen before. Like, we could finish each other's sentences a lot of the time, and I think once there was a trust between us, defining the specifics became really fun and easy.
And a film really is like a vessel, and it's about, can you deliver the cargo to the other shore in a way? And it comes across. And it was a very challenged film, very little money, very little time. But, the way you've got to gauge something like that and the success of something like that is, does the thing realize the promise of the story and of the character? And am I happy with how it turned out? Yes.